Good morning. My name is Lucia Vera, and I want to welcome you to our breakout session, Shaping the Future of Canadian Leadership. We have our panelists. Let me first tell you a little bit more about me. I am a professor of strategy at Ivy. I am also the director of the Leadership Institute, which specializes in character development. And the mission is to develop leaders with character who strive to make a difference in the world. Let me introduce you our three panelists. First, Dr. Lawrence Musio. He is one of Canada's leading business historians. His career in many ways has focused on how leaders in business and government, past and present, have confronted opportunities and grand challenges. His career in scholarship as an advisor also for senior executives and policymakers has been dedicated to applying history to generate insight and foresight for better decision making. He's also the CEO of the consulting firm Signal Influence. He personally advises senior executives in a variety of sectors. He's also the chair and co-founder of the Long Run Institute, connecting senior decision makers to actionable insight by linking critical historical experience to very relevant topics. And the Institute is working very closely with Lawrence in creating some roundtables, for example, on relating character leadership, purpose-driven leadership, and ESG, which we are going to be implementing in the next weeks. Let me also introduce you. Thank you, Lawrence, for being here. Savan Palvetsian. Savan is the president and CEO of UNICEF Canada, the leading humanitarian organization dedicated to helping children around the world survive, thrive, and reach their full potential. Savan is widely respected as a Canadian leader who has built and led high-performance teams in each of the public, corporate, and NGO sectors. She was named one of Canada's top 100 most powerful women by WXN. Before her appointment at UNICEF, she was the senior fellow at the Mank Center of Global Affairs and Public Policy, an executive advisor to leading companies in Canada and the US on ESG and its related impact on organizational strategy. And we have here Martha Matsnevsky, also my colleague, an Ivy professor, and the faculty director of executive education at Ivy Academy. She has taught in more than 50 countries in her career, and she has spent her career working with leaders who have finished their degrees and are actually, practicing leaders. She's an expert in global teams, global leadership, culture and identity, and empowering individual differences. So please help me to welcome our panelists. Thank you for being here. The format we're going to use is I'm going to start with one question. I'm going to get an opening statement for this question from our panelists. And then we also have here, you're going to see that the question that our panelists are going to discuss is about shaping the leadership of 2050 in Canada. How should that leadership look like? And how are we going to get there? So it's two parts. There was a student competition at Ivy with that same topic, and we have the winners of that student competition here. So we will also get a chance to hear the ideas of our MBA students on the future of leadership in 2050. After that, we'll talk about development, and we will open it up to your comments. Maybe you want to share with us what is your vision for how leadership should look like in Canada in 2050, or any questions for our panel. So that's what we're going to do in the next 45 minutes. So let me start with you. What kind of leaders and leadership culture, so it's leadership, but also the culture of leadership, do you think Canada needs in 2050? And let me start with Lawrence.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lucia. 25 years is a long time. 2050 seems to be very far off, but recently I've been reading two kind of strange books that on the future that has kind of made me think about the coming decades. And the first is AI 2041, 10 Visions of Our Future by Kai-Fu Lee and Chen Kuifan. It's essentially 10 stories set in the year 2041, Munich, Tokyo, digital artist, people who want to blow up the world, etc. So it explores the impact of AI on the future in the next 2 decades. And it kind of seeks to avoid the kind of dystopian or utopian extremes. That's the first book. Second book is 2034, a novel of the next world war, and that's a geopolitical thriller that has been widely read among my friends in Washington and the defense establishment and in policymaking. And essentially it recounts a series of escalating events that leads to a devastating conflict between the USA and China and other global powers. So there's a kind of a diplomatic failure and kind of highlights also technological dependencies that can trigger catastrophic outcomes. And so both novels, to me, are focused on the kind of existential questions on AI and technology and on geopolitics. And both subjects kind of force us to consider the longer term future, and you can't do that without considering the present and without also understanding kind of the deep context. And both books, I think, I highly recommend them, by the way, are in a sense cautionary tales about the only law of history that matters, and that's the law of unintended consequences. It's relevant to this discussion, I think, for a couple of reasons, apart from the fact that it's imagining the future. The first is I don't think we know what our poor country will face in 2050 because that law of unintended consequences. Will we need leaders for war or peace? Will we have a country? Will that make a difference in how we answer the questions about what kind of leaders we want in the culture? And the second thing, I think, is the best thing you can do to prepare for that kind of uncertainty is to understand two things, or at least do two things. And one is to know your present and to know your history, how we got here, essentially. And there was a lot of that implicit in the CEO forum this morning. And I would also say to read science fiction, because they imagine they're not constrained by facts, and so they can. There's a kind of a creative imagination about what might happen. So the best histories kind of give you a pattern recognition, a context about how that's unfolded, and where it might continue, or where we might actually break with the past. So it kind of pulls back the veil on complexity. So what about Canada in 2050? Niels Bohr once said, prediction is difficult, especially if it's about the future. And I think we do have a centuries-long data set about Canadian leadership to compare against in a couple of millennia in terms of humanity from the time of Themistocles and so forth. So the question is, can you detect a pattern throughout time and space about what makes an effective leader? And if you can, how can you emulate those qualities that we can identify as essential to leadership? Now, there are some personal ones, the ability to speak well, the ability to have confidence to speak when, for example, you're in the minority and the consensus is against you. The understanding, perhaps, the more capable you become, that you might incur envy and jealousy. The dangers of maybe getting too successful, too much attention, and how you deal with that. So there are some eternal things that leaders kind of need to know. The big question in terms of Canada in 2050, like I said, we don't know. What the law of unintended consequences might lead us into different, but we had some of them this morning, did we not? Technology is one of them. The energy transition, that if we don't get that right, we may endanger our prosperity. I would say also the unity of the country, which was not a question 5 or 6 years ago, but might be a question today and tomorrow. Fragmenting social cohesion, globalization, economic nationalism. I'm trying to cheer you up. The threats of international trade. We're not in a very happy place at this time, and I think that if anything, Dave and Jeff and Linda this morning kind of made an understatement. But there are tremendous opportunities. But I think publicly, just generally speaking, as an opening, I would say we need to return to a Canadian tradition of having a clear-eyed understanding of what the world is, not as we wish it to be, and that was discussed this morning. And that involves a kind of much more pragmatic approach to policy, I would say, and decision-making based on the national interest. And we kind of need to take stock of the scale of the challenge as well. So leaders also need to speak with much more courage and moral clarity than perhaps our times have allowed them to do. So, and I would just end this sermon by saying that there's one thing that true leaders have that is very rare, and that is foresight, in the Greek pronoia. And there are very few leaders in time and space that have had that, but those leaders that do can see things coming 5 and 10 years down the line. And we need those leaders. I don't know who they are. I don't think we know anybody just yet, but it may emerge, but we need to be on the lookout for that. So not just insight, not just managers, but foresight. You think of people like Churchill and others that did have that, and of course there are a lot of ancient examples. But I'll just end it there. I will just say I'd be in favor of a 3-person junta for 5 years, just running the country. No, I'm kidding, of course. That would be horrible, wouldn't it? It would be much more effective, but it would be horrible. And, I'm very much a Democrat, but just like 5 or 6 years, just kind of clean up stuff, put us on the right track. And then, but it never works out that way, does it? But ours is the much more difficult task of actually dealing with the messy business of democracy. And that is going to be a huge challenge. And Ducia, thank you for the time that you've allowed.
Thank you, Lawrence. Martha, tell me, what is your vision in terms of the kind of leaders we need and the culture we need for 2050?
I've been an obsessive reader of science fiction for 50 years. And small secret, although now it's not going to be, I read way more science fiction than I do business books. So I'd love to trade reading lists with you sometime. And it actually does influence how I think about things. But especially really good science fiction. I'm actually going to be a little bit more pragmatic based on what I've seen. I think the leaders that we need for 2050 and also to get us to 2050 are leaders that are going to lead action through collaboration. And I picked that very specifically, the focus on the action driven through collaboration across different groups of stakeholders. And the reason that the collaboration is kind of a no-brainer, right? We've got different stakeholders, different views. We heard about that in lots of different ways already today. You've experienced it in many ways already today, I'm sure. What I see a lot of though is that the extreme focus and awareness of the importance of collaboration often prevents us from taking action. And I work in a lot of contexts where people are driving so much to find that elusive win-win, to find the consensus that we get paralyzed. And we end up trying to get that perfect policy, that perfect plan, and then not taking actions we know that will make things a little bit better. And so I think we need leaders who can take us through to there. And talking recently with a lot of leaders about why we don't get to action from this kind of analysis paralysis, I hear words like fear and even embarrassment. I'm afraid of getting it wrong. What about those unintended consequences? Let's just wait. Let's do it one more time. Embarrassed. I was talking with a leader just yesterday who talked about how people were embarrassed that they didn't have what they thought was the expertise needed to get there. And so these things lead to the fears, or to this kind of paralysis. So I think we need leaders who can take us forward to that. And I often think about a leader I met 20 years ago in my career who had this really kind of nice definition in his world or in his mind about the difference between consensus and commitment that has really stayed with me. We can define consensus in lots of ways, but he said consensus is an agreement to come to a lowest common denominator. It's an agreement to take out all the risk. Commitment is an agreement to take a risk together. And so in his leadership, he was focusing on, and he was a small insurance company, it wasn't a big multinational or anything, but it was how can we lead in a way where we're willing to take a risk together and we commit to making it work. So I think leaders who can and lead that. So I've thought a lot about what does it take to lead multiple stakeholders from different walks of life to collaborate, to get to the commitment to take actions. And I think, so I'm going to be the professor now, 3 things, right? 1, 2, 3. Based on the research and based on the evidence, it takes 3 things. One is leading in a way that generates trust in each other's intentions. A lot of stuff gets thrown around about trust. Trust is, and you know, it's a big buzzword, and leaders use it, I think, quite flippantly. If everything worked, it's because we trusted each other. If it didn't, it's because we didn't trust each other. But if we get much more precise about trust, we can look at different aspects of it. Trust in each other's intentions is a very specific kind of trust that is achievable through deeper understanding and listening to each other and generating respect. Leaders can influence that. The second thing is willingness to take action for small steps. Right? We don't need to wait until we have how can we make things better tomorrow? How can we make things a bit better tomorrow? We heard some great examples of that already today. So leaders who can take that trust and how can we take steps tomorrow? And the third one, and this won't be surprising to people who know me, an obsession for learning. An obsession for leading processes where we take the trust, we take the small steps, and then we learn from that with analysis. So the analysis doesn't go into planning the perfect plan. The analysis goes into what did we learn from what we just did? How did we work together to make it work a little bit better? How did it not work? And how can we put that analysis into the next step? So I'm not saying get rid of the analysis and the planning, but it's put it into the learning stages, not so much into that. So I think we need leaders who can do those 3 things. Who can develop trust among people in each other's intentions, develop the propensity to take action and in small steps, and then obsession about learning those things. And I think I'm just going to stop there because I like the science fiction stuff so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Martha.
Eager to hear other things.
Martha, your comment reminded me of that research that says we judge others on their behaviors, and we judge ourselves on our intentions. So you're saying, how would things change if we would actually trust others' intentions versus just looking at the behaviors and forgetting, what was the intention?
There's a person behind that.
There's a person behind that behavior.
Who has the same intentions I do, or at least the same direction.
Exactly. Saban, tell us, what is your vision?
Okay, first off, I don't read science fiction. But I do love history. And I did a couple of degrees in history at Western, actually. So it was back in the late 1999, I was finishing my master's in history. And if you'd have asked me in that moment what 25 years from now would look like and what a leader would need and what the world would be, I would have done my best patterning on the past to guess that. But in those 25 years or 20 some years since that, I've been able to live it as a leader. And I've had the privilege of a career where I've been an executive in every sector: government, NGO, corporate, and now the humanitarian aid world at UNICEF. And what's fascinating to me is how leadership shows up the same and then differently in every single one of those sectors. So I'm going to share a few thoughts on what leadership in the future ought to look like, coming from that perspective. Someone who's sort of had a 360, if you will, in some of those experiences. The first is that a leader today, and some are faking it, gang, some are faking it, but today, and increasingly by 2050, better be able to zoom up and connect down. Davos last year, the word was polycrisis. This idea that a series of crises are going to continue to come at us at record speed and with unprecedented patterning is our new normal. And so if leaders don't have the ability to embrace that degree of complexity, well, good luck to you, because it doesn't slow down. 1960s and the end of the 1960s was the last era where we could effectively still live in our silos. That's gone. And we could take you through, and I could show you with the research, lots of ways in how that's changed. But the idea that if you can't embrace complexity as a leader, if your executive team can't think about geopolitics, the opioid crisis, housing costs, migration patterns, if your executive team and folks within your organization aren't adept at that degree of complexity, it's going to be really hard to be really good as the world gets more complex. Connect down. Yes, leaders need to be able to zoom up and think about the big world and how these pieces fit together. But if you can't connect with your people, that culture is nothing but a bunch of font on the wall. We know through the Edelman Trust Barometer, which has been brilliantly produced for 20-some years, how is trust evolving? You talked about this. The number one group that we trust now are our employers. It's 25 points more than government officials. We trust our employers as the source of truth. So when a company, when an organization weighs in on a social issue, it's more than just a public relations moment that gets sent out in a press release or an investment that gets sent out with its corporate responsibility budget. Our people are expecting leaders to understand those social, environmental, political issues, geopolitical issues, as I wear my UNICEF hat. Our people expect that of us. And the connection that we need in the loneliest generation that's walked the planet means that the role of our employer in our source of truth, in our source of connection, and our link to purpose has also never been higher. So think about that if you can as a leader. You need to be able to zoom all the way up to 50,000 feet to understand how the news headlines and what might be coming affect your business, your organization, your risk management, your strategy. But then I also need to understand how my colleague down the hall might be feeling and what the organization needs to provide to her or him on a regular human level. Who can do that as leaders? Well, a group like this knows how to do that as leaders. But if you're not building a culture that teaches people to think about with those two toggles, I don't think that will be effective by 2015 in the next series of challenges that leadership will bring. Point 2. Yes, I love history. I remember I did my first degree and my parents said, so then when's law school? And I said, I'm just going to do a second degree in history and then I'll get there. And I actually never did. Life just got in the way and got too interesting doing other things. But there's something special about the Renaissance period, where we taught people to think about a range of things as opposed to specialized Navy SEALs. Even Rafa this morning, our brilliant keynote speaker, she talked about how specialized the skills are. It worries me, gang. Because you want to find the person who misses most of the corners most often, it's a specialized Navy SEAL. The Renaissance thinkers take in different data points, consider different outputs, read different things, talk to different people, have a wisdom of crowd that fuels how they think. They're smarter. They're smarter. They may not be as technically sound in some areas, but as a well-rounded leader, back to my first point, how are you going to spot what's coming? Who do you think has the advantage? The Renaissance thinker. So when you're building your teams and when you're thinking about your professional development programming within your organizations, are you only honing expertise? Or are you encouraging not only who sits around your table, but how you encourage people to think to be very diverse? Arts, science, literacy, literature. Go hard on Renaissance because something magical happened in that 200 or 300 year window, and we are losing some of that. Some of the best leaders I've seen in my 360-degree career are Renaissance thinkers. The last point I'll make is around the impact of collective action. If you're doing anything alone, I guarantee you're doing it wrong. I worked as an executive member. I ran communications and corporate responsibility for one of Canada's largest companies, $30 billion market cap, 26,000 employees, many different business lines, highly regulated industry. I think I was the only person who'd ever worked in government that sat around that executive team. That may not mean anything, but it did give a perspective of how working with government feels and looks different. If you have an interest in understanding what communities need, what is your engagement strategy authentically with NGOs? If you have, and you heard it from Dave Mackay this morning, brilliant ideas, in this case, on the agribusiness future of Canada, that is not punching above our weight in productivity, but can in this space, what's the engagement with government going to be? And farmers and the like. And so if you are doing it alone, you're doing it wrong. And if I guarantee one point for 2050, it will be that. Yes, you need to have leaders that can zoom up and connect down. Yes, we need to ensure we're protecting the Renaissance thinking, not just the specialization. But absolutely, if we don't embrace collective work to tackle these big issues, we will miss them 100% of the time.
Thank you, Savan. Thank you. So at this point, I want to invite our students, our MBA students representing our newer generation of MBAs, to tell us a little bit about the paper. Do we have a microphone in the back? Yes. Okay, let's use that. They are Arthur Bronsim and Nihal Nishadul, and the paper, the title of the paper was, If Not Us, Then Who? Accountability and Collectiveness, Building the Leaders We Need for the Future We Want.
So first of all, I want to thank you all for having us here and for giving us the opportunity to start this conversation, to be part of this conversation. Is a great responsibility for two MBA students. And I want to start this by asking you all a question that we asked ourselves during our thought process. Have you ever thought that we are able to produce a piece of technology that is right now outside the solar system, sending us information from there, at the same time that I have a trouble calling my friend that lives across the city every time I got into the subway? Or have you ever thought that we can detect water on Mars at the same time that around 20% of Earth population has no access to safe water? Or putting planets aside, have you ever thought that we can produce very fancy models to help us on predicting cancer's diagnosis at the same time that we still have gender inequality to face? Reality can be a little bit tricky and confusing with these examples, but more than this, reality is very capable of producing inequality and not a sustainable future. And this is why discussing the leaders that we need in the future is so important. And our small contribution to that, and I'm happy to say that we got points that really resonate to what was said here. The first point that we got is basically accountability. Leaders in the future must be accountable for what is happening. And the biggest point is the gender pay gap that we all condemn is not happening outside the solar system. It's actually happening in our companies, probably just a few doors down the corridor. Or maybe our biggest companies or companies that are not responsible with the environment, they are not coming from Mars. They are actually most likely part of our supply chain at some point. Or that office that is not really a safe place for diversity or different cultures might be our own office. And the point here is not to make us feel guilty with this paper, but actually to just start a thinking process in us all. That is, every time that we are part of the problem, we have the chance to be part of the solution too. So once we realize that our decisions that we made inside our companies go beyond the walls of those companies, we can understand, and we can really understand that we can make a difference. And that's why accountability is so important.
And when we pitched this idea to some of our friends in the program, the reaction we got was, of skepticism, like can I even make a dent in this like pervasive global issues that we face, right? And it's fair. When you think about doing things on your own, this is definitely a fair reaction. However, we feel like one of the themes that came up in the discussions in the morning and now as well was collaboration. And that is the second key trait that we want our leaders in the future to really demonstrate and really exercise. And we can go into details about how we can collaborate. We've already heard like great stories and great ways how people have collaborated across industries, across even just across teams to get to great solutions. However, just to impose the urgency of when we need to start seeing these changes in people. Let me give you some stats. Like this is an IV event. We all love stats. So the average age of a CEO or an executive in Canada is 50 to 55 years old. And in 2050, the CEO who's 50 or 55 is currently going to be around the age of 22 to 27. So a current MBA student or an HBA student probably at Ivy. So if you think about it, the academia has a big part to play in shaping their mindset to accommodate collaboration and also accommodate accountability into their way of thinking. But if academia is the supply of these resources, they eventually make their way into industry, and industry grows them up and shapes up their career, right? So we also think that industry has a big role to play in training and development in their leadership development program, which is something you mentioned, and also their recruitment process to really focus on these two attributes, because they will make sure that we put people in Mars. We also solve the bigger issues that we face in our world right now. And also we make sure that we can call people from the subway when we need to.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you. And that's the perfect connection to the next question, which is, how do we get there? And you mentioned the role of educational institutions, business schools, and also the role of organizations. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about how do we get there? What is the role, or what can business schools do, or any educational institution at any level really do, and organizations to get to those leaders for 2050? Lawrence, you want to start?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, I think it is a larger task, and of course we can't do it alone. The collaboration, and I think kind of a wise architecture for shaping, let's say, educational design is needed. I think I wouldn't be too prescriptive about what kind of programs. I mean, apart from the leader character programs and so forth, the Institute, which I think is an interesting experiment. It's not just an experiment; it's much more than that. But it is a serious attempt to talk about the connection between character and leadership, to foster that collaboration, etc. I mean, I think everybody would agree that collaboration is important, right? But it's how you do it, and I think if you look around, I think with reference to what Siobhan was saying about corporations, having a higher trust than, say, government, I think part of it is because they've been by necessity implementing some of those ideas about collaboration and team of teams, etc. And I think that is very. I think that needs to be underlined. It was underlined by the award winners here in terms of collaboration and so forth. We don't need to go to Mars, but or the Mars District, which is, I kept thinking the Mars District. Okay, no, but that's a Toronto joke. I'll explain it later. But the issue, I think, is, I think we need. So there are all kinds of really nice things that we got to do. Well, yes, we need to collaborate. Yes, we need to, but how is it going to be inculcated in the curriculum? I think part of it for me, as I've kind of studied leaders for a long time and discussed it with them, in the last maybe 20 years or thereabouts, I think we need to focus on, and this might come, linked to this Renaissance idea. We need people to think at a strategic depth, to think historically about problems, to understand the deeper forces at play. And that is against that hyper-specialization. So there needs to be a broader formation. And this is especially in the last couple of years, what I've seen at the kind of more senior levels is that not necessarily the leaders, but the Praetorian Guards and the others who support them, they're struggling because they don't have that formation. So they need, I think that is something extremely important. I think moral courage is probably something you can't teach, but the willingness to make unpopular decisions that are in the best interest of the greater good. And I think that ties to what Martha was saying about analysis paralysis, or honestly having that commitment. And also, I think importantly, and I think this is what Canadians struggle with, maybe because there's this idea that we're nice or we want to get along, etc. I think the intellectual autonomy to challenge prevailing wisdom, and I think that is one of our. We've got many interesting cultural traits as Canadians. Let's say that intellectual autonomy and the challenge to prevailing wisdom is not one of them. I think that is maybe we consider ourselves too nice, or maybe we're too passive aggressive, or something like that, right? Or afraid, or whatever. But this has led to a culture. This is not true in the United States so much. I mean, we like to hammer our neighbor to the south, but I was having a lunch with somebody yesterday who is very senior in artificial intelligence, and she was mystified as to how AI policy at the federal level was done, because she had never been consulted. She's a very, very senior person, never been consulted. So where's that collaboration, right? So the collaboration is like, there's no collaboration. And I think if we can kind of harness the power, let's say, for example, of Ivy and of other places, to link those, to connect those. This is the work that we're trying to do with the Long Run Institute, to connect, say, historians or political science or whoever to senior corporate executives, to government policymakers on grand challenges, and to have no holds barred talk. That often requires not being public. So it has to be private, because people will not speak in public. I was astonished that Mackay and Co. They were actually pretty frank about the problems. They probably understated them, and probably in private they would turn up the volume a little bit. But I think that's the kind of where we need a serious kind of reflection there. And I think to the extent that our programs can foster that, then we can hope a little bit, But the historical perspective, especially, is just missing. It's what Mackay talked about. He talked about short-term thinking. It's not just short-term thinking in terms of next 5 or 10 years, but also taking a more holistic look at where we've come, either to say we should continue, or we need to really stop to break the pattern of that pattern recognition. So I don't know how you codify that in a curriculum, but that's your job.
It's my job, yes. Martha.
Or my job, I'll take that one too. I'm a huge believer in experiential education and experiential development. So maybe it's easier to make a distinction between what people typically think of as teaching and creating situations where people learn. which I think is what we do at Ivy and what brought me back to Ivy, to be honest, when I came back to Canada, is a real belief that the way you develop people is by putting them in situations where they learn and guiding the learning process and facilitating the learning process. And we can do that in programs and we can do that in organizations as well. And the more we connect it with people's real life experiences and kind of shape the situation, but then take the learning as it comes, the more we build all of the things that we've been talking about. And I keep coming back to my most powerful experience doing this. I really would love to replicate it at Ivy. So if anybody from Ivy can help me do this, I'd love to do it. But for 5 years in a row, I took students to Johannesburg, South Africa. And we had 14 days there. The first 11, 10, we're working with companies, and we identified a group of small to medium sized enterprises. So going concerns, not entrepreneurs. So they weren't startups, they were companies. And we made sure that we got a complete range. So we were in townships, we were in luxury parts of Sandton, we were in manufacturing, we were in services, we were every sector of both the population and the industry and the economy was represented among our 20 different projects. And then we assigned to each of those companies a team of 3 to 5 MBAs, depending on the size of it. And we put them in with the organizations on the first day. And the only assignment they had was, by the time we leave, the company has to be doing better. You got 10 days. And we made it like a reality TV show kind of thing, and we made it exciting. But it was, by the time you leave, they have to be doing better. And it's up to you to figure out what that means. We had one rule. The rule was you are not allowed to give a PowerPoint presentation on the last day. And in fact, you were strongly encouraged to never give a PowerPoint presentation. If the company culture demanded it for legitimacy, then you could do that, but it couldn't be the last day. And what the students learned pretty quickly is that the business challenges were, like you were saying, they weren't insurmountable. But the implementation challenges were. And so they learned very quickly to develop relationships with people who were very different from them, and to really care about these people. And by the weekend, they were invited to family homes for barbecues. We tried setting up cultural events on the weekend the first year we did it, and we realized we didn't need to, because by the time we got to the weekend, the students were totally embedded in the communities. They were running soccer clinics. They were, going to all kinds of things all over the place on the weekends. And when they left, the companies were doing better. And the lessons stayed with both the students and those companies for a very long time afterwards. The thing was, it was incredibly labor intensive. So when I stopped being the MBA program director, that project stopped because it was a lot of work to set up the situation and facilitate the situation to guide the learning through it. So I think as both organizations and as educational institutions, there are great ways to develop leaders to do these kinds of things, but it's less about controlled teaching in a classroom, even controlled case teaching, right? Case teaching is a step towards this, but it's about moving beyond controlled case teaching even to creating situations where people can learn and facilitating through that. And that's labor, that's intensive, and you can't control it, so you don't quite know what's going to work. And a colleague of mine ran a program quite similar for, it doesn't matter, Norwegian military part, but it was very similar. And the more they embedded it in experiences, the lower the satisfaction ratings of the students immediately afterwards, but the higher the learning about leadership. So it's not only hard to do, it's also not satisfying in the moment for the people leading it or even for the participants. So I think we need to accept that those kinds of dynamics are there and work through it, because the learning is incredibly powerful.
Thank you, Martha. Savan?
Okay. And let me start by acknowledging how great the MBA
Yeah.
students' presentation was. And if we're looking into the future of how we're going to be doing in Canada, I'm less worried. Well done. What do we need to do to develop leaders in the style in which we've been talking about? 5 things. 5 things I'm going to share with you. 1, scenario planning. We do a really poor job of prioritizing scenario planning in most organizations today. Even think about, when was the last time you were authentically asked to do a really big live scenario planning, whether that's a cyber attack, whether that's something major to the supply chain disruption. But we don't know what series of crises will appear. We do know they will. So scenario planning as a core muscle and part of a routine of what we ought to be producing our leaders to do regularly. Think about all the things you get regular updates on in your organizations. Are we teaching you how to do scenario planning? Short answer is no. Some do, but generally no. So that's point 1. We cannot develop leaders of the future that don't have that muscle. 2, diversity. And I mean that in every sense of the word. If you are sitting around a meeting table, or if you're on the screen and you see your colleagues, and most of you have graduated from roughly the same kind of schools, with roughly the same kind of degrees, at roughly the same time, that's a problem. That's a problem. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. That's a fact. So if you have diversity around you, your diversity of thought increases as well. One of the best books I've ever read, James Surowiecki, The Wisdom of Crowds. It's required reading on my leadership teams wherever I've worked because it's so good and proves this point. But diversity of who you hire, how you construct your team, whom you choose to hear from, what is expected of your career trajectory. Are we just building I's, meaning people that go into content depth, or are we building T's? You have content depth, but you have a diversity of how that's applied. We need T's. Point 2. Point 3, Chief Risk Officer. We all probably need one, but be careful. Because when you have an organization whose job title is Chief Risk Officer, it may suggest to others, I don't need to think about that. The risk people do that. The audit people do that. That's over. Wrong. Wrong. Risk is every one of our jobs, right? Whether you're the junior policy analyst, whether you are the CEO, whether you are the person who works on the strategy in the corporate team, risk is every single person's job. So be careful when at the topic of risk or mitigation strategies, everybody's head turns to look at the audit team or the No. Point it at ourselves. How we teach leaders to be, every one of us, a chief risk officer is important for leadership going forward. Number 4, who do we bring into our organizations to learn from, and how authentic are we about curiosity? Remember my point around zoom up, all the different data points? Whom are we bringing in? Because we like to hear their information and we model for our teams that diversity of thought is worth hearing. How do we reward you in your performance plan about how curious you are? We want leaders to be able to meet the needs. We need to build it into what we expect them to think about, chew around, and then get evaluated against as well, okay? And then lastly, I want to talk about supply chain. In 2021, COVID was still a banana-mobile, and if you were to listen on the analyst calls to the S&P top 500 companies, 3,000 times in those analyst calls, even before the year end, 3,000 times CEOs and chief operating officers and CFOs talked about supply chain, supply chain, supply chain. That's why you can't get your sofa right now. That's why the pet food is on back order. That's why cauliflowers are $13. Supply chain, supply chain, supply chain, supply chain. Some of that was surprising. Most of that ought not have been. And so the mastery of supply chain, and I work at UNICEF, where for 77 years we've been in 190 countries on the ground understanding what's happening. So I've been able to be, through the privilege of this role, have a purview to a whole bunch of other insights and data that in the corporate world I never thought about, right? But supply chain and getting our arms around that, whether that's what Linda talked about this morning with energy solutions in Canada, whether that's how we're thinking about water, which was something raised earlier. P.S., in the day that we're sitting here, 1,000 children under the age of 5 will die around the world from drinking unsafe water. Yeah. So supply chain is one of the most important, and I would suggest to you, often overlooked area of leadership that, just like risk, does not sit down the hall with the people that do the logistics. It's got to be something that we're all thinking about. Walmart is an interesting company where they've embraced supply chain thinking with their value proposition. They have 100,000 suppliers that produce stuff for Walmart, right? They've figured out if your sustainability practices as one of those 100,000 companies meet our benchmark, says Walmart, then we're going to work with HSBC Bank to give you cheaper interest rates to loan money. Win-win. Supply chain. Leaders need to be losing sleep about it, fascinated by it, and driven to be ahead of some of what's going to come on that front. We'll leave it there.
Thank you, Savan. We have run out of time, so we will not have time for questions, but please come to us at lunch to continue these conversations. Wow. We had so many thoughts that we use all the time. But I loved two of the themes. There were many themes, but two that I really love is this idea of complex thinking, paradoxical thinking, the both and solutions. And for that, we need the Renaissance thinkers. We need to trust each other's intentions. I also love the theme of collaboration, which, yes, Lawrence, it's very easy to say, let's collaborate. But when we look at around the world today, the question is, why can't leaders talk to each other? Why is it so difficult to have these conversations? Because maybe we don't trust our intentions, or maybe because we don't have enough complexity of thought or diversity of thought. So definitely, Martha and I have a checklist now to think about our curriculum. But like the message of this morning, everybody really starting with our families can start developing the leaders of 2050. So thank you for being here, and hope we have more conversations about this. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you.